This is Dalat, a beautiful city in the south-central highlands of Vietnam, sitting at an altitude of 150 meters above sea level. It's nicknamed the City of Eternal Spring because of its cool, pleasant climate, and it's also called the City of 1,000 Pines, because pine trees are everywhere. The city boasts incredible views, a mild climate, great local food, colonial-era architecture, and there's plenty to do. It's the history of this little city that's so fascinating and as good a place as any to start a discussion on colonialism. Because what's incredible is that just over 100 years ago, nothing stood here. There were no buildings, only trees and natural vegetation. And then, during the French colonial era, when what's now Vietnam was colonized by the French, a Frenchman was trekking through the forest in an uninhabited area of Cochin, China. He was on a scientific expedition and whilst taking a break from the daily hike, looked over from his elevated position on the side of a mountain, probably observing a view not so dissimilar to this one, and he decided that a city should be built here. One can only imagine the confidence of these people to be in the middle of nowhere and decide, yeah, why not? Just build a city 10,000 kilometers from home and in an area with no road or rail access. But such an attitude was typical of the time. The colonial French, like their British counterparts, believed in themselves. They never imagined a day would come when their empire would end. The French wanted a place to chill, away from the bustle of Saigon, a hot, sticky place, as is much of Vietnam, not ideal for Europeans not fond of tropical climates, so it was the perfect spot, in the hills at an altitude that kept the weather cool. It was French scientist Alexandre Yersin who was on that expedition in 1893. The then French governor, Paul Doumer, greenlit the project, and architect Ernest Embry was tasked with the urban planning. First came the construction of Dalat Palace, which they planned to sit on a hillside overlooking a lake. But there was no lake, so they built one, damming the local river to form a 5-square-kilometer mass of water. This is Xuan Hung Lake today. Beyond the lake would be the city centre, hosting a market, cafes, small businesses, homes for the locals and so on. And on the upper side of the lake along the hills, villas, house after house after house of them, would house the rich. So if you see an old terracotta roof, chances are the French built it. And it really is quite remarkable how many of them there are. Sometimes in a state of somewhat disrepair, sometimes repurposed by the local government and used for official business, sometimes repainted a distasteful green. Lots of them are restaurants, holiday homes, homes for rent, and so on. The city layout still follows Embry's original plan. The city centre hasn't moved, the villas still line the original boulevard at the top of town. And again, it's impressive, the foresight required to do this, to plan so well, that there's been no need to adjust the blueprints that were drawn up over 100 years ago. The Vietnamese have continued to build on what they've inherited, but they haven't had to revise it.
Que reste-t-il de nos amours? Que reste-t-il de ces beaux jours? Une photo, vieille photo de ma jeunesse.
The first building was the Dalat Palace, completed by the early 20s, and then the Hotel du Parc was built behind it, a boulevard separating them and secret underground passageways connecting the two. And finally this building, Le Café de la Poste, was added to complete the complex. This is the dining room in the Hotel du Parc. You see the melding of Art Nouveau expressed in the detailed floral designs on the overhanging shades, an Art Deco which was the new aesthetic of the time, an expression of wealth and power and exuberance, seen here in this fountain on the right. The elevator in the lobby is another nice example of this 1930s design movement. So here the French elite mingled, an impressive lineup of guests, politicians, actors, poets and playwrights, debutantes and so on. You can really feel the spirits of Frenchmen when you walk into rooms like these, as if stepping back in time. The paintings on the walls haven't changed and the furniture is largely the same, refurbished but original. Here's the billiards table, the bar. What stories were talked about? Who seduced who? What scandals occurred? This seems to echo around you in places like these, probably romanticized by the mind, but still real. And people continue to stay here for that connection with the past, to be excited by history. This dining room remains a nice spot for breakfast. By the 40s, the town had a cinema, a golf course, numerous hotels, and of course all the infrastructure required to support urban living: sewage works, street lamps, hospitals, schools. This is the Lycée Yassin, named after the city's founder, where the children of French colonialists and of the wealthy Vietnamese elite would study. Today, it's been repurposed as a pedagogical college. Another building of interest is this train station, designed by French architects and opened in 1938. What's really interesting here is the effort to include the Vietnamese in this design. The angle of the roof's peaks deliberately reflect indigenous homes. This shape was designed to be familiar to the Vietnamese, so they could feel a connection to it. And this speaks of the way in which the French colonized. They wanted to take the local population with them on this journey. They wanted the Vietnamese to feel included in this effort and to teach them the glory of France. The town was and still is popular with French and locals alike. The last emperor of Vietnam, Bao Dai, he liked it so much that he had 3 properties built here. The guy had 5 wives and several concubines and was a philoprogenitive man with over 10 children, so I suppose he needed places to house them all. This is one of his houses. It's not that attractive if I'm honest. Looks a bit like a Bond villain's residence, doesn't it? But at the time this was considered pretty hip and modern, and I like the garden. It's always quiet here. The interior is a little damaged by damp, but otherwise fairly well preserved. Again, we see the French influence, which serves as a nice metaphor for Bao Dai's political career. He was often criticised for being too much of a Francophile, for being a willing, self-serving puppet of the French regime. By 1945, he'd abdicated, the last emperor of the Nguyen dynasty. Today, Dalat is a thriving agricultural city. The climate made it ideal for farming everything the French couldn't usually find. Rosemary, for instance. It dies quickly in the heat anywhere else in southern Vietnam, but at the cool altitude of Dalat, it flourishes. They planted broccoli, potatoes, strawberries, vineyards, and coffee farms, all of which continue to be profitable industries today. The experience of being here and feeling this presence of Frenchmen, to look at their unquestionable achievements, it got me thinking of colonization, because it is sold to us as an unequivocal evil and something we must denounce and feel shame for, something discussed without nuance. But it is much more complicated than that. It's more of a mixed bag. On the one end of the scale, we have groups that went extinct, colonized people who, through disease, genocide, or intermarriage, or a combination of the above, cease to exist. They may live on genetically, as a couple of % of the genes of the population that went on to replace them, but the people who go on to occupy their lands do not speak their language, they don't practice their religion, and they do not identify by their name. An example of this would be the Taino people who occupied the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Following their first contact with European man, they were largely wiped out by disease and then intermarried with the Spanish colonialists, which finally finished them off. If you go to the Dominican Republic today, the land once occupied by the Tainos, no one speaks the Arawakan language anymore. The Dominicans do not call themselves Taino. They consider themselves Latino, and as a group, their genetic makeup is 50% European, 40% black, and just 8% Taino. The Taino culture, language, religion, and themselves as a population group, as an ethnic group, as a people with a distinct genotype, all were lost. This is surely the worst outcome for the colonized, to be genetically replaced. But the French did not do this to the Vietnamese. They never put the Vietnamese population under any threat of extinction. They made no great efforts to integrate with them. They did not intermarry except in rare instances among elite families. And they did not impose their culture or customs on the majority of the nation. Yes, they built cathedrals and churches, and downtown Saigon is dotted with buildings that look like they've been teleported from Paris. But the Vietnamese retained their culture in both rural and urban areas, and were able to practice their customs and ways unimpeded. There were no great disease outbreaks by coming into contact with European man. There was no genocide or great campaign of oppression. In fact, the reverse is true. The campaign of pacification enacted by the French was designed to win the hearts and minds of the locals through investment in their communities. And so during colonial rule, the Vietnamese population grew. Their access to education and standards of living improved, and their lifespans extended. Regardless, the Vietnamese did not like being colonized. They fought for independence, initially adopting the Fabian strategy, guerrilla warfare, opting to sabotage and disrupt the enemy, avoiding frontal assaults in favor of ambushes, meeting the enemy only when the odds were in their favor. When fighting an enemy of superior size and strength, you have to be sneaky. You must only choose to engage the enemy when you know you can win. So the Viet Minh army continued on like this for several years, blowing up trains and assassinating bureaucrats, and building up strength until they could adopt a more aggressive and direct approach. In 1954, the French marched to Dien Bien Phu, a valley in the north of the country, where they set up camp, hoping to draw the Viet Minh into a decisive battle. But General Vo Nguyen Giap, the lead strategist of the Viet Minh army, outplayed the French. He assumed an elevated position, surrounded his enemy, and bombed the hell out of them. After 65 days of siege, the Vietnamese had forced the French to surrender. They defeated a French army corps, and in doing so, liberated North Vietnam. Less than 2 years later, in 1956, the French were forced to leave the country. Even though victorious, the Vietnamese had lost 4,000 men, double the French casualties. And it would take millions more lives and a struggle lasting till 1975 to finally reunite Vietnam as one free, independent country.
刚才说是你们受欧洲国家管理这么长时间，应该是学到了很多先进的管理经验。
哪有多少时间？没多少时间了。我们炒那个要那个国经济啊，很炒。现在是50年了。这几50年那个，
就是50年以前，你不是都受他们
50年以前什么都好啊。
是啊，那个先进的影响，那个代代往传下来，越传越文明越发达了，怎么越来越倒退越落后了？你看这么先进的铁路，我1930几年就有电气化铁路，我这是中国啥时候才有电气化铁路的？你看矿区那个铁路，电气化的双轨铁路，因为架得多好。你看现在顶上那个什么，哎呀，千疮百孔啊！ 破烂不堪了，把原来留下的东西根本都没有更加的爱护保护去利用它，反而都遭到了毁灭性的重创，就成成这样子的了。只有慢慢经过几代人。
In the first place, it's not true that the wealth or the benefits of the West derived from exploiting the colonies. The facts are against you. The reason why you say that is because it is so hard for people to get out of the notion that life is a zero-sum game. They think if one man benefits, another must lose. But in a free market, both people can benefit. Now, if you take the case of Africa, the wheel had not been invented in parts of Africa by the end of the 19th century. The number of people in Africa and their average conditions of life in Africa have grown enormously as a result of their contacts with the West. Well, I would say you don't know your facts, sir.
One can scarcely discuss colonialism without Africa being brought up. I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but in wondering whether Africa benefited from being colonized or not, Friedman is right. In innumerable, measurable ways, Africans gained from European governance. They lived longer in safer, more prosperous societies. A brief glance at liberated Africa today is very revealing. Whilst the left paint the chaos of the continent as a hangover of colonialism, indeed as being directly caused by colonialism, as if Africa would have been a rich continent full of Wakanda-esque functioning societies if it weren't for the exploitation Africans suffered at the hands of evil white men. The truth is, these people, on receiving independence, were simply unable to preserve or build on what they'd inherited. It's worth noting that Africans are not the only peoples to regress after gaining independence. Following the decline of the Roman Empire, when the Romans left the island of Britain, the Brits entered the Dark Ages. The aqueducts crumbled, law and order collapsed, towns were abandoned, and savagery and barbarism plagued the land. We were just unable to maintain a civilization at this point. So one could argue that we were better off under our Roman masters, at least in material terms of wealth, security, infrastructure, and so on. One could equally make the same argument for Africans if, again, you adopt a materialist view, like Friedman does, looking at life expectancy and wealth and security and ignoring the spiritual. But what of the spiritually debilitating effect of being colonized? Of a people robbed of their independence, sovereignty, and ability to express their culture and to choose the direction of their path through history? Many Africans lost their rights to practice their religions. Their languages often declined in usage or completely disappeared. Distinct and separate tribes were forced to become countrymen, and the subsequent close proximity of rival groups led to conflict, war, and in some cases, genocide. Surely, no people of dignity can accept such a condition. Would you, my dear viewer, accept the colonization of your lands by a superior alien race, even if it meant material gain? So it's strange when people justify colonization in the manner that Friedman does by pointing out that both the West and the nations they colonized economically benefited. Even though he's right, does this really matter? Wouldn't you rather be poor yet free than rich and enslaved? And yet those aforementioned gains of colonialism are tangible. Most African peoples had never built nor lived in anything close to a civilization before the Europeans brought it. And today, in this post-colonial age, much of the continent has slipped into abject barbarity.
Unamkutana anajifichika, anatararamika, unamwambia asilalamike. Basi kati unaona halalamiki, mnakutanana na mwacho na shendera, utamtoa mwingine mtenda mkutanana kwenye anajifichika kupori kule mnalalamia kule na mtu anashendera.
Eza contrôle nazo contrôler pays. Nazo sala pe uti na sala kaka pona bisala sala te nazo sala pe na contrôler te o ya koza malade te o koza na malade.
Bo ezaki siko ezaki banini ya bukoko ya mboka. Po ifoka ka tozo kaka mwasi. Kote oresi.
Bo basi wana bazoke ngona makasi te po eza domaine oyo eza lakina bitumba. Bitumba na batumba tutu za kubundango eza kipe na bakisi. Kisi wana ezalaki soki bo violer basi ndebo kozama force ko gagner banguna o baye ko bebisa Congo na biso. Yango mona kindenge wana
ezaki kaka nini ya mboka po tozaki okoma na mboka na mitindo na yango ba Hollande ndelwa na biso ke soki tosibani boye tokoresi. Tozaki bango po ezaki kakisi na biso.
Na sama mota muo kisha manza mbaka unamuua mtoto, hakuna tena kuhesabia miaka. Nikamata tukatoto atakapata hivi tunakabaka kisha tunajendei. Maana tukafaa bakaji kiolele. Wengine tunaniga, wengine tunabaka, vitu kuharibisha, mabotike tunaharibisha. Na hivi vitu tukarusha mbaya sana.
How many women has he raped?
7.
Kataba 5. Kwa udogo ni 8. Baoi.
Bo na eba zaki kidnappé près 18.
Na nouveau zalaki lokola yo moko yebindenge front ezalini kona kotize basi na komisa ta 25. Oui.
Kwangu mimi pekee kwa jisabila ni bakaka wanamuke 53. Bo bado wanamuke sisi masebya miaka ngapi, lakini kulikuwa kabasika ba miaka 18, banamuke ya miaka 13, 14 na watoto ya miaka 5, miaka 6. Kubaka ni kupatana na raha ni tulikuwa nayo, mlikuwa maplezire mingi. Sasa tuko na baka tunasikia tuko huru.
Our targets are like people who like stay alone in most places, like ladies who stay alone.
Have you ever tried to get into someone's shack and rape a woman in there?
Yeah, we've done it. We've done it a couple of times.
What you used to break in?
We have every tool. We have this thing, a crowbar. Yeah, we use that to open doors mostly. As soon as the door is open, she's gonna scream, obviously. As we walk in, we tell her to shut up. We pull out our knives, and then we're gonna start with her, put her in her own bed and rape her.
So she would be offering you money, and then what happens?
No, do that and take the cash as well.
You take the money and still rape her?
We still rape her. Sometimes we'd actually rape your girlfriend with you watching us. If he doesn't cooperate, we're gonna have no choice but to stab him.
What is the most number of people that have been involved in a gang rape?
It was 4. I think it was 4. It was the 4 of us.
You just took turns on that person?
Yeah, we just took turns.
One after another.
We made her run naked, you know, things like that.
Crazy things, actually.
We were tossing bricks and things at her while she was running, you know, things like that.
Sometimes making fun of her, the fact that she's actually scared and terrified.
Have you ever thought how bad it is for the person that you have raped?
No, actually, it never comes to mind to me sometimes. Mostly, it never comes to mind.
I can't understand that. Where is your conscience then?
No conscience at all.
No conscience.
Remember how I said the left blame this chaos and barbarity on colonization? The contrary is true. We went to places without legal systems, without courts, without anything but vigilante mob justice, and introduced the common law system. In Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Malawi, and others, the judges and lawyers still wear long red robes and horsehair wigs. The British built these people courthouses and gave them the finest legal system in the world, a required cornerstone of civilization. And of course, this included the prohibition of barbaric practices, one example of which, not from Africa but in India, would be the banning of sati, the funeral custom of widow suicide. The wife of a recently deceased man would be expected to throw herself on her husband's funeral pyre and burn till death. Doubtless, superstitious rape practices, such as raping an infant family member to cure a disease or raping a village of women to make you impervious to bullets in battle, would have been prohibited under colonial rule. Perhaps millions of African women today would not have been raped if our empires persisted. And let's briefly look at how justice is routinely dished out in Africa today.
What happens when you come across someone who has raped in the area?
Yeah, we ban the people. Yes, we ban the people.
When we ban a person, we start to heat first, so that a person can die hard. We start heat. Before we put a petrol and also the tie, we use tie and petrol. Then after we use a matches or gun light, the person must get burned. And we make sure that person, when burns, don't have to run.
And how many mob justices have you ever participated in?
Many, because I try to help community. I have kids.
But when the mob plays judge and jury, mistakes are inevitable. And the consequences are horrific. Have you had a suspect who is innocent and has been killed?
Sometimes we catch the wrong person.
If we get a wrong person, it's probably we didn't do research or investigate properly.
But back to Vietnam and the questions of colonialism. One must adopt several perspectives and look at this question from both sides, from the colonizer and the colonized, and in the short and long term. In the short term, the colonized materially benefit and spiritually suffer, whilst the colonizer both materially benefits and spiritually gains. They take pride in their extraordinary achievements and the examples of the courage of their people. But in the long term, empires collapse. For those who are colonized and manage to defeat their invaders, they gain an enormous sense of pride and, should they be capable, maintain their material benefits. They inherit made cities, medical, scientific and architectural knowledge, and they have a narrative that fulfills their people. The knowledge that they defeated a technologically superior power. This serves to unite them in patriotic vigor. But for the colonizer, the collapse of their empire demoralizes their nation. They no longer believe in themselves. Theirs is a narrative of former glory and subsequent failure. The story of colonization is often twisted to further demoralize and subvert the national character. They are the descendants of imperialist scum, say the left. Their ancestors enslaved and brutalized and ruthlessly submitted harmless, good people to their will. Such stories are exaggerations or even outright lies, and any achievements and honourable actions conducted during the Age of Empire are underplayed, forgotten, or viewed as part of a broader white supremacist narrative. It is deemed uncouth, archaic, and racist to to have any pride with regards to empire. Indeed, now the West must repent, pay reparations, open their borders to the subjects of their former empire. They must renounce their loyalty to their nation. National pride is seen as a telltale sign of their inner desire for imperialist violence and the oppression of foreign, weaker peoples. This highly demoralizing paradigm has greatly weakened European nations and subverted the identity of European peoples. To not be able to take pride in yourself or your nations ensures national decline. For as Richard Rorty so eloquently put it, national pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary condition for self-improvement. So there it is, lads, the end of the video. Well done for making it this far. It was hardly my most exciting video, was it? A very different video than I usually make. I even read it in a different voice. You know, it was much slower. There were no jokes. I promise that if you didn't like this one, the next video will be back to my usual style, back to my usual reading voice. Lots of gags, lots of comedy. A little bit of housekeeping just before you go. If you want to support this channel, you can now on Subscribestar. You can also support me on Patreon. And if you want to make a one-time donation, you can do it on PayPal. Of course, if you don't want to do that, no problem, but please do this. Please follow me on BitChute, subscribe to me over there, and follow me on Telegram. I've just started the channel. I post the occasional funny video and, you know, I post my thoughts over there. You never know when I'm going to get kicked off YouTube, so it would really help me out if you would follow me on these alternative platforms. I think we all need to do that now because they're cracking down. The censorship's getting worse. The links to all of this can be found below in the description box. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I love you all. Have a fantastic rest of your day and don't be black-pilled, all right, lads? Keep your chin up, keep trucking. Take care. Bye.